Chapter 1 of Sylvia's Lovers. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Terence Callan. Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. Chapter 1, Monkshaven. On the northeastern shores of England there is a town called Monkshaven, containing at the present day about 15,000 inhabitants. There were, however, but half the number at the end of the last century, and it was at that period that the events narrated in the following pages occurred. Monkshaven was a name not unknown in the history of England, and traditions of its having been the landing place of a throneless queen were current in the town. At that time there had been a fortified castle on the heights above it, the site of which was now occupied by a deserted manor house, and at an even earlier date than the arrival of the queen, and coeval with the most ancient remains of the castle, a great monastery had stood on those cliffs, overlooking the vast ocean that blended with the distant sky. Monkshaven itself was built by the side of the Dee, just where the river falls into the German Ocean. The principal street of the town ran parallel to the stream, and smaller lanes branched out of this and straggled up the sides of the steep hill, between which and the river the houses were pent in. There was a bridge across the Dee, and consequently a bridge street running at right angles to the High Street, and on the south side of the stream there were a few houses of more pretension, around which lay gardens and fields. It was on this side of the town that the local aristocracy lived. And who were the great people of this small town? Not the younger branches of the county families that held hereditary state in their manor houses on the wild bleak moors that shut in Monkshaven almost as effectually on the land side as ever the waters did on the seaboard. No, these old families kept aloof from the unsavory yet adventurous trade which brought wealth to generation after generation of certain families in Monkshaven. The magnates of Monkshaven were those who had the largest number of ships engaged in the whaling trade. Something like the following was the course of life with a Monkshaven lad of this class. He was apprenticed as a sailor to one of the great ship owners, to his own father possibly, along with 20 other boys, or it might be even more. During the summer months he and his fellow apprentices made voyages to the Greenland seas, returning with their cargoes in the early autumn, and employing the winter months in watching the preparation of the oil from the blubber in the melting sheds, and learning navigation from some quaint but experienced teacher, half schoolmaster, half sailor, who seasoned his instructions by stirring narrations of the wild adventures of his youth. The house of the ship owner to whom he was apprenticed was his home and that of his companions during the idle season between October and March. The domestic position of these boys varied according to the premium paid. Some took rank with the sons of the family, others were considered as little better than servants. Yet once on board an equality prevailed, in which, if any claimed superiority, it was the bravest and brightest. After a certain number of voyages, the Monkshaven lad would rise by degrees to be captain, and as such would have a share in the venture. All these profits, as well as all his savings, would go towards building a whaling vessel of his own, if he was not so fortunate as to be the child of a ship owner. At the time of which I write, there was but little division of labor in the Monkshaven whale fishery. The same man might be the owner of 6 or 7 ships, any one of which he himself was fitted by education and experience to command. The master of a score of apprentices, each of whom paid a pretty sufficient premium, and the proprietor of the melting sheds into which his cargoes of blubber and whalebone were conveyed to be fitted for sale. It was no wonder that large fortunes were acquired by these ship owners, nor that their houses on the south side of the River Dee were stately mansions full of handsome and substantial furniture. It was also not surprising that the whole town had an amphibious appearance, to a degree unusual even in a seaport. Everyone depended on the whale fishery, and almost every male inhabitant had been or hoped to be a sailor. Down by the river the smell was almost intolerable to any but Monkshaven people during certain seasons of the year, but on these unsavory staiths the old men and children lounged for hours, almost as if they reveled in the odors of train oil. This is perhaps enough of a description of the town itself. I have said that the country for miles all around was moorland. High above the level of the sea towered the purple crags, whose summits were crowned with greensward that stole down the sides of the Scaur a little way in grassy veins. Here and there a brook forced its way from the heights down to the sea, making its channel into a valley more or less broad in long process of time. And in the moorland hollows, as in these valleys, trees and underwood grew and flourished, so that while on the bare swells of the high land you shivered at the waste desolation of the scenery, when you dropped into these wooded bottoms you were charmed with the nestling shelter which they gave. But above and around these rare and fertile vales there were moors for many a mile, here and there bleak enough, with the red freestone cropping out above the scanty herbage. Then perhaps there was a brown tract of peat and bog, uncertain footing for the pedestrian who tried to make a short cut to his destination. Then on the higher sandy soil there was the purple ling, or commonest species of heather growing in beautiful wild luxuriance. Tufts of fine elastic grass were occasionally to be found, on which the little black-faced sheep browsed. But either the scanty food or their goat-like agility kept them in a lean condition that did not promise much for the butcher, nor yet was their wool of a quality fine enough to make them profitable in that way to their owners. In such districts there is little population at the present day. There was much less in the last century, before agriculture was sufficiently scientific to have a chance of contending with such natural disqualifications as the moors presented, and when there were no facilities of railroads to bring sportsmen from a distance to enjoy the shooting season and make an annual demand for accommodation. There were old stone halls in the valleys. There were bare farmhouses to be seen on the moors at long distances apart, with small stacks of coarse, poor hay and almost larger stacks of turf for winter fuel in their farmyards. The cattle in the pasture fields belonging to these farms looked half-starved, but somehow there was an odd, intelligent expression in their faces, as well as in those of the black-visaged sheep, which is seldom seen in the placidly stupid countenances of well-fed animals. All the fences were turf banks, with loose stones piled into walls on the top of these. There was comparative fertility and luxuriance down below in the rare green dales. The narrow meadows stretching along the brookside seemed as though the cows could really satisfy their hunger in the deep, rich grass, whereas on the higher lands the scanty herbage was hardly worth the fatigue of moving about in search of it. Even in these bottoms, the piping sea winds, following the current of the stream, stunted and cut low any trees, but still there was rich, thick underwood, tangled and tied together with brambles, and briar-rose and honeysuckle, and if the farmer in these comparatively happy valleys had had wife or daughter who cared for gardening, many a flower would have grown on the western or southern side of the rough stone house. But at that time gardening was not a popular art in any part of England. In the north it is not yet. Noblemen and gentlemen may have beautiful gardens, but farmers and day laborers care little for them north of the Trent, which is all I can answer for. A few berry bushes, a black currant tree or two, the leaves to be used in heightening the flavor of tea, the fruit as medicinal for colds and sore throats, a potato ground, and this was not so common at the close of the last century as it is now, a cabbage bed, a bush of sage and balm and thyme and marjoram, with possibly a rose tree, and old man growing in the midst, a little plot of small, strong, coarse onions, and perhaps some marigolds, the petals of which flavored the salt beef broth. Such plants made up a well-furnished garden to a farmhouse at the time and place to which my story belongs. But for 20 miles inland there was no forgetting the sea nor the sea trade. Refuse shellfish, seaweed, the offal of the melting houses were the staple manure of the district. Great ghastly whale jaws, bleached bare and white, were the arches over the gate-posts to many a field or moorland stretch. Out of every family of several sons, however agricultural their position might be, one had gone to sea, and the mother looked wistfully seaward at the changes of the keen, piping moorland winds. The holiday rambles were to the coast. No one cared to go inland to see aught, unless it might be to the great annual horse fairs, held where the dreary land broke into habitation and cultivation. Somehow in this country sea thoughts followed the thinker far inland, whereas in most other parts of the island, at 5 miles from the ocean, he has all but forgotten the existence of such an element as salt water. The great Greenland trade of the coasting towns was the main and primary cause of this, no doubt. But there was also a dread and an irritation in everyone's mind, at the time of which I write, in connection with the neighboring sea. Since the termination of the American War, there had been nothing to call for any unusual energy in manning the Navy, and the grants required by government for this purpose diminished with every year of peace. In 1792 this grant touched its minimum for many years. In 1793 the proceedings of the French had set Europe on fire, and the English were raging with anti-Gallican excitement, fomented into action by every expedient of the Crown and its ministers. We had our ships, but where were our men? The Admiralty had, however, a ready remedy at hand, with ample precedent for its use and with common, if not statute, law to sanction its application. They issued press warrants, calling upon the civil power throughout the country to support their officers in the discharge of their duty. The sea-coast was divided into districts under the charge of a captain in the Navy, who again delegated sub-districts to lieutenants, and in this manner all homeward-bound vessels were watched and waited for, all ports were under supervision, and in a day, if need were, a large number of men could be added to the forces of His Majesty's Navy. But if the Admiralty became urgent in their demands, they were also willing to be unscrupulous. Landsmen, if able-bodied, might soon be trained into good sailors, and once in the hold of the tender, which always awaited the success of the operations of the press gang, it was difficult for such prisoners to bring evidence of the nature of their former occupations, especially when none had leisure to listen to such evidence, or were willing to believe it if they did listen, or would act upon it for the release of the captive if they had by possibility both listened and believed. Men were kidnapped, literally disappeared, and nothing was ever heard of them again. The street of a busy town was not safe from such press gang captures, as Lord Thurlow could have told, after a certain walk he took about this time on Tower Hill, when he, the Attorney General of England, was impressed, when the Admiralty had its own peculiar ways of getting rid of tiresome besiegers and petitioners. Nor yet were lonely inland dwellers more secure. Many a rustic went to a statute fair or mop, and never came home to tell of his hiring. Many a stout young farmer vanished from his place by the hearth of his father, and was no more heard of by mother or lover. So great was the press for men to serve in the navy during the early years of the war with France, and after every great naval victory of that war. The servants of the Admiralty lay in wait for all merchantmen and traders. There were many instances of vessels returning home after long absence and laden with rich cargo, being boarded within a day's distance of land, and so many men pressed and carried off that the ship with her cargo became unmanageable from the loss of her crew, drifted out again into the wild, wide ocean, and was sometimes found in the helpless guidance of one or two infirm or ignorant sailors. Sometimes such vessels were never heard of more. The men thus pressed were taken from the near grasp of parents or wives, and were often deprived of the hard earnings of years which remained in the hands of the masters of the merchantman in which they had served, subject to all the chances of honesty or dishonesty, life or death. Now all this tyranny, for I can use no other word, is marvelous to us. We cannot imagine how it is that a nation submitted to it for so long, even under any warlike enthusiasm, any panic of invasion, any amount of loyal subservience to the governing powers. When we read of the military being called in to assist the civil power in backing up the press gang, of parties of soldiers patrolling the streets, and sentries with screwed bayonets placed at every door, while the press gang entered and searched each hole and corner of the dwelling, when we hear of churches being surrounded during divine service by troops, while the press gang stood ready at the door to seize men as they came out from attending public worship, and take these instances as merely types of what was constantly going on in different forms, we do not wonder at Lord Mayors and other civic authorities in large towns complaining that a stop was put to business by the danger which the tradesmen and their servants incurred in leaving their houses and going into the streets, infested by press gangs. Whether it was that living in closer neighborhood to the metropolis, the center of politics and news, inspired the inhabitants of the southern counties with a strong feeling of that kind of patriotism which consists in hating all other nations, or whether it was that the chances of capture were so much greater at all the southern ports that the merchant sailors became inured to the danger, or whether it was that serving in the navy, to those familiar with such towns as Portsmouth and Plymouth, had an attraction to most men from the dash and brilliancy of the adventurous employment, it is certain that the Southerners took the oppression of press warrants more submissively than the wild northeastern people. For with them the chances of profit beyond their wages in the whaling or Greenland trade extended to the lowest description of sailor. He might rise by daring and saving to be a shipowner himself. Numbers around him had done so, and this very fact made the distinction between class and class less apparent, and the common ventures and dangers, the universal interest felt in one pursuit, bound the inhabitants of that line of coast together with a strong tie, the severance of which by any violent, extraneous measure gave rise to passionate anger and thirst for vengeance. A Yorkshireman once said to me, "My county folk are all alike. Their first thought is how to resist. Why, I myself, if I hear a man say it is a fine day, catch myself trying to find out that it is no such thing. It is so in thought, it is so in word, it is so in deed." So you may imagine the press gang had no easy time of it on the Yorkshire coast. In other places they inspired fear, but here rage and hatred. The Lord Mayor of York was warned on 20th January 1777 by an anonymous letter that, if those men were not sent from the city on or before the following Tuesday, his lordship's own dwelling, and the mansion house also, should be burned to the ground. Perhaps something of the ill feeling that prevailed on the subject was owing to the fact which I have noticed in other places similarly situated. Where the landed possessions of gentlemen of ancient family but limited income surround a center of any kind of profitable trade or manufacture, there is a sort of latent ill will on the part of the squires to the tradesman, be he manufacturer, merchant, or shipowner, in whose hands is held a power of money-making which no hereditary pride or gentlemanly love of doing nothing prevents him from using. This ill will, to be sure, is mostly of a negative kind. Its most common form of manifestation is in absence of speech or action, a sort of torpid and genteel ignoring all unpleasant neighbors. But really the whale fisheries of Monkshaven had become so impertinently and obtrusively prosperous of late years, at the time of which I write, the Monkshaven ship owners were growing so wealthy and consequential, that the squires, who lived at home at ease in the old stone manor houses scattered up and down the surrounding moorland, felt that the check upon the Monkshaven trade likely to be inflicted by the press gang was wisely ordained by the higher powers. How high they placed these powers I will not venture to say, to prevent overhaste in getting rich, which was a scriptural fault, and they also thought that they were only doing their duty in backing up the admiralty warrants by all the civil power at their disposal, whenever they were called upon, and whenever they could do so without taking too much trouble in affairs which did not, after all, much concern themselves. There was just another motive in the minds of some provident parents of many daughters. The captains and lieutenants employed on this service were mostly agreeable bachelors, brought up to a genteel profession. At the least they were very pleasant visitors when they had a day to spare. Who knew what might come of it? Indeed, these brave officers were not unpopular in Monkshaven itself, except at the time when they were brought into actual collision with the people. They had the frank manners of their profession. They were known to have served in those engagements, the very narrative of which at this day will warm the heart of a Quaker, and they themselves did not come prominently forward in the dirty work which, nevertheless, was permitted and quietly sanctioned by them. So while few Monkshaven people passed the low public house over which the navy blue flag streamed, as a sign that it was the rendezvous of the press gang, without spitting towards it in sign of abhorrence, yet perhaps the very same persons would give some rough token of respect to Lieutenant Atkinson if they met him in High Street. Touching their hats was an unknown gesture in those parts, but they would move their heads in a droll, familiar kind of way, neither a wag nor a nod, but meant all the same to imply friendly regard. The ship owners, too, invited him to an occasional dinner or supper, all the time looking forward to the chances of his turning out an active enemy, and not by any means inclined to give him the run of the house, however many unmarried daughters might grace their table. Still, as he could tell a rattling story, drink hard, and was seldom too busy to come at a short notice, he got on better than anyone could have expected with the Monkshaven folk. And the principal share of the odium of his business fell on his subordinates, who were one and all regarded in the light of mean kidnappers and spies, varmint, as the common people esteemed them, and as such they were ready at the first provocation to hunt and to worry them, and little cared the press gang for this. Whatever else they were brave and daring. They had law to back them, therefore their business was lawful. They were serving their king and country. They were using all their faculties, and that is always pleasant. There was plenty of scope for the glory and triumph of outwitting, plenty of adventure in their life. It was a lawful and loyal employment, requiring sense, readiness, courage, and besides, it called out that strange love of the chase inherent in every man. 14 or 15 miles at sea lay the Aurora, good man-of-war, and to her were conveyed the living cargoes of several tenders which were stationed at likely places along the sea-coast. One, the Lively Lady, might be seen from the cliffs above Monkshaven, not so far away, but hidden by the angle of the highlands from the constant sight of the townspeople. And there was always the Rendezvous House, as the public house with the navy blue flag was called thereabouts, for the crew of the Lively Lady to lounge about, and there to offer drink to unwary passers-by. At present, this was all that the press gang had done at Monkshaven. End of chapter 1.